At a later time, it's going to be announced that the Ripley seems a little more antibiotic resistant than the first believed, and that a number of patients have died. The names have given out will be those of people who in fact already died, either as a result of the Ripley or those gruesome fucking implants. Do you know what the men are calling the implants? Yeah, shit, weasels. Will the president didn't mention them? No way. The guys in charge believe the shit weasels are just too upsetting for John Q. public. As would be, of course, the facts concerning our solution to the problem here at Gosselin's store. That rustic beauty spot. The final solution, you could call it, Owen said. He had smoked his cigarette all the way down to the filter and now crushed it out on the rim of his empty coffee cup. Kurtz's eyes rose to Owen's and met them unflinchingly. Yes, you could call that. We are going to wipe out approximately 350 people, mostly men. There's that, but I can't say the cleansing won't include at least a few women and children. The upside, of course, is that we'll be ensuring the human race against a pandemic and very possibly subjugation. Not an inconsiderate upside. Owens thought, I'm sure Hitler would be like this spin. Was unstoppable, but he covered it well as he could, and got no sense that Kurtz had heard it or sensed it. Impossible to tell for sure, of course. Kurtz was sly. How many are we holding now? Kurtz asked. About 70, and twice the number on the way from Kineo. They'll be around 9 if the weather doesn't get any worse. We're supposed to, but not until after midnight. Kurtz was nodding. Uh-huh. Plus I'm going to say 50 more up from north, 70 or so from St. Caps or those little places down south, and our guys, don't forget them. The math seemed to work, but we already picked up 4 cases of Ripley in the medical briefings. The men of course don't know. Don't they? Let me rephrase that, Kurtz said. Based on their behavior, I have no reason to believe the men know, all right? Owen shrugged. The story, Kurtz resumed, will be that the detainees were being flown to a top-secret medical installation, a kind of Area 51, where they will undergo further examination and, if necessary, long-term treatment. There will never be another official statement concerning them. Not if all goes according to plan, but there will be time-release leaks over the next 2 years, encroaching infection despite best medical efforts to stop it. Madness, grotesque physical changes, better left undescribed, and finally death comes as a mercy. Far from being outraged, the people will be relieved. While in reality, he wanted to hear Kurtz say it, but he should have known better. There were no bugs here, except maybe for the ones hiding between Kurtz's ears. The boss's caution was ingrained. He raised one hand, made a gun of his thumb and forefinger, and dropped his thumb 3 times. His eyes never left Owen's as he did this. Crocodile's eyes, Owen thought. All of them? Owen asked. The ones who aren't showing Ripley positive as well as those who are? And where does that leave us, the soldiers who also show negative? The laddies who are okay now are going to stay okay, Kurtz said. Those showing Ripley were all careless. One of them, well, there's a little girl out here, about 4 years, cute as the devil. You expect her to start tap dancing across the barn floor and singing, "On the good ship Lollipop." Kurtz obviously thought he was being witty, and Owen supposed that in a way it was. But Owen himself was overcome by a wave of intense horror. There's a 4-year out there, he thought. Just 4 years old, how about that? She's cute and she's hot. Kurtz was saying. Visible ripply on the side of one wrist, growing at her hairline, growing in the corner of one eye. Classic spots. Anyway, the soldier gave her a candy bar just like she was some starving Kosovar rug muncher, and she gave him a kiss. Sweet as pie, a real Kodak moment. Only now she got a lipstick print that ain't lipstick growing on his cheek. Kurtz grimaced. He had himself a tiny little shaving cut, barely visible, but there goes your ball game. Similar stuff with the others. The rules don't change, Owen. Carelessness gets you killed. You may go along lucky for a while, but in the end it never fails. Carelessness gets you killed. Most of our guys, I'm delighted to say, will walk away from this. We are going to face scheduled medical exams for the rest of our lives, not to mention the occasional surprise exam. But look at the upside. They're gonna catch your ass cancer wicked early. The civilians who appeared clean, what about them? Kurtz leaned forward, now at his most charming, his most persuasively sane. You were supposed to be flattered by this, to feel yourself one of the fortunate few to see Kurtz with his mask. 2 parts pattern, 1 part Rasputin, add water, stir and serve. Lay it aside. It had worked on Owen before, but not now. Rasputin wasn't the mask. This was the mask. Yes, even now, here was the hell of it. He wasn't completely sure. Owen, use your brain. That good brain God gave you. We can monitor our own without raising suspicions or opening the door to a worldwide panic. There's gonna be enough panic anyway, after our narrowly elected president slays the Fuka horse. We couldn't do that with 300 civilians. And if we really flew them out to New Mexico, put them in some model village for 50 or 70 years at the taxpayer's expense, what if one or more of them escaped? Or what if I think this is what the smart boys are really afraid of? Given time, the Ripley mutates. That instead of dying off, it turns into something a lot more infectious and a lot less vulnerable for the environmental factors that are killing it here in Maine. If the Ripley is intelligent, it's dangerous. Even if it isn't, what if it serves the Grayboys as a kind of a beacon? An interstellar road flare marking our world out. Yum yum, come and get it. These guys are tasty and there's plenty of them. You're saying better safe than sorry. Kurtz leaned back in his chair and beamed. That's it. That's it in a nutshell. Well, Owen thought. It might have been a nut, but this shell is something we're not talking about. We watch out on our own. We're merciless if we have to be, but even Kurtz watches out for his laddybugs. Civilians, on the other hand, are just civilians. You need to burn them. They go up pretty easy. If you doubt there is a God, and that he spends at least some of his time looking out for his good old Homo sap, you might look at the way we are coming out of this, Kurtz said. The flashlights arrived early and were reported. One of the reports came from the store owner, Reginald Gosselin himself. Then the Grayboys arrive at the only time of the year when there are actually people in this god-forsaken woods, and 2 of them saw the ship go down. God's grace is what it was. Their ship crashes, their presence is known, the cold kills both them and the galactic dandruff they brought along. He took the points off rapidly on his long fingers, his white eyelashes blinking. But that's not all. They do some implants and the goddamn things don't work. Far from establishing a harmonious relationship with their hosts, they turn cannibal and kill them. The animal kill-off went well. They senused something like 100,000 critters. and there's already one hell of a barbecue going on over by the Castle County line. In the spring or summer, we would have needed to worry about bugs carrying the Ripley out of the zone, but not now, not in November. Some animals must have gotten through. Animals and people both, likely, but the Ripley spreads slowly. We are going to be all right on this because we netted the vast majority of infected hosts. Because the ship has been destroyed and because they brought us smolders rather than blazes. You send them a simple message, come in peace or come with your ray guns blazing, but don't try it this way again because it doesn't work. We don't think they will come again, or at least not in a while. They played fiddly fuck for half a century before getting this far. Our only regret is that we didn't secure the ship for the science boffins. But it might have been too Ripley infected anyway. Do you know what our greatest fear has been? That either the Grayboys or the Ripley would find a typhoid Mary. Someone who could carry it and spread it without catching it him or herself. Are you sure there isn't such a person? Almost sure. If there is, well, that's what the cordon's for. Kurtz smiled. We lucked out, soldier. The odds are against the typhoid Mary. The Grayboys are dead, and all the Ripley is confined to the Jefferson Tract. Luck or God. Take your choice. Kurtz lowered his head and pinched the bridge of his nose high up, like a man suffering a sinus infection. When he looked up again, his eyes were swimming. Crocodile tears, Owen thought. But in truth, he wasn't sure. And he has no access to Kurtz's mind. Either the telepathic wave had receded too far for that, or Kurtz has found a way to slam the door. Yet, when Kurtz spoke again, Owen was most positive he was hearing the real Kurtz, a human being, not a tick-tock the croc. This is for me, Owen. Once this job is finished, I'm going to punch my time. If this storm's as bad as they say, and it'll be nasty, but the real nightmare's tomorrow morning, I can hold up my end, I guess, but after that, well, I'm eligible for full retirement, and I'm going to give them their choice. Pay me or kill me. I think they'll pay because I know where too many bodies are buried. That's the lesson I learned from J. Edgar Hoover. But I've almost reached the point of not caring. This won't be the worst one I have been involved in. In Haiti, we did 800 in a single hour. 1989 that was, and I still dream about it. But this is worse. By far. Because those poor schmucks out there in the barn and the paddock and the coral, they're Americans. Folks who drive Chevys, shop at Kmart, and never miss ER. The thought of shooting Americans, massacring Americans, that turns my stomach. I'll do it, only because it needs to be done in order to bring closure to this business, and because most of them would die anyway and much more horribly. Capiche? Owen Underhill said nothing. He thought he was keeping his face properly expressionless, but anything he said would likely give away his sinking horror. He had known this was coming, but to actually hear it. In his mind's eye, he saw the soldiers drifting toward the fence through the snow, heard the loudspeakers summoning the detainees in the barn. He had never been a part of an operation like this. He had missed Haiti, but he knew how it was supposed to go, how it would go. Kurtz was watching him closely. I won't say all is forgiven for that foolish stunt you pulled this afternoon, that water's under the bridge. But you owe me $1. I don't need ESP to know how you feel about what I'm telling you. I'm not going to waste my breath telling you to grow up and face reality. All I can tell you is that I need you. You have to help me this one time. The swimming eyes, the infirm twitch, barely perceptible at the corner of his mouth. It was easy to forget that Kurtz has blown a man's foot off not 10 minutes ago. Owen thought. If I help him do this, it doesn't matter if I actually pull a trigger or not. I'm damned as the man who herded the Jews into the showers at Bergen-Belsen. If we start at 11, we can be done by 11:30, Kurtz said. Noon at the very worst, then it's behind us. Except for the dreams. Yes, except for them. Will you help me, Owen? Owen nodded. He had come this far and wouldn't let go of the rope now, damned or not. At the very least, he could help make it merciful. As merciful as any mass murder could be. Later, he would be struck by the lethal absurdity of this idea. But when you are with Kurtz, up close and with his eyes holding yours, perceptive was a joke. His madness was probably much more infectious than the Ripley in the end. Good! Kurtz slumped back in his rocker, looking relieved and drained. He took out his cigarettes again, peered in, and then held the pack out. 2 left. Join me. Owen shook his head. Not this time, boss. Then get on out of here. If necessary, shag ass over to the infirmary and get some Sonata. I don't think I'll need that, Owen said. He would, of course. He needed it already, but he wouldn't take it. Better to lie awake. All right then, off you go. Kurtz let him get as far as door. And, Owen! Owen turned back, zipping his parka. He could hear the wind out there now, building, starting to blow seriously as it had not during the relatively harmless Alberta clipper that had come through that morning. Thanks, Kurtz said. One large and absurd tear overspilled his left eye and ran down his cheek. Kurtz seemed unaware. In that moment, Owen loved and pitied him, in spite of everything, which included knowing better. Thank you, Buck. Henry stood in the thickening snow, turned away from the worst of the wind and looking over his left shoulder at the Winnebago, waiting for Underhill to come back out. He was alone now. The storm had driven the rest of them back into the barn where there was a heater. Rumors would already be growing tall in the warmth, Henry supposed. Better the rumors than the truth that was right in front of them. He scratched at his leg, realized what he was doing, and looked around, turning in a complete circle. No prisoners, no guards. Even in the thickening snow, the compound was almost as bright as noonday. And he could very well see in every direction, for the time being at least. He was alone. Henry bent and untied the shirt knotted around the place where the turn signal stalk had cut his skin. He then spread the slit in his blue jeans. The men who had taken him into custody had made this same examination in the back of the truck where they had already stowed 5 other refugees. On the way back to the Goslins, they had picked up 3 more. At that point, he had been clean. He wasn't clean now. A delicate thread of red lace grew down the scabbed center of the wound. If he hadn't known what he was looking for, he might have mistaken it for a fresh seep of blood. Byrus, he thought. Ah, fuck. Good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are. A flash of light winked at the top of his vision. Henry straightened and saw Underhill just pulling the door of the Winnebago shut. Quickly, Henry retied the shirt around the hole of his jeans and then approached the fence. A voice in his head asked what he'd do if he had called to Underhill, and the man just kept on going. That voice also wanted to know if Henry really intended to give Jonesy up. He watched Underhill trudge toward him in the glare of the security lights, his head bent against the snow and the intensifying wind. The door closed. Kurtz sat looking at it, smoking and slowly rocking. How much of his pitch had Owen bought? Owen was bright. Owen was a survivor. Owen was not without idealism, and Kurtz thought Owen had bought it all, with hardly a single dicker. Because in the end, most people believed what they want to believe. John Dillinger had always been a survivor, the wiliest of the 30s desperados, but he had gone to the Biograph Theatre with Anna Sage just the same. Manhattan melodrama had been the show, and when it was over, the feds had shot Dillinger down in the alley beside the theatre like a dog he was. Anna Sage had also believed what she wanted to believe, but they deported her ass back to Poland just the same. No one was going to leave Gosselin's market tomorrow except for this pickled cadre, the 12 men and 2 women who made up Imperial Valley. Owen Underhill would not be among them, although he could have been, until Owen had put the Grayboys on the common channel. Kurtz had been sure he would be, but things changed. So Buddha has said, and on that one at least, the old chink heathen had spoken true. "You let me down, Buck," Kurtz said. He had lowered his mask to smoke, and it bobbed against his grizzled throat as he spoke. "You let me down." Kurtz had let Owen Underhill get away with letting him down once, but twice? Never, Kurtz said. Never in life. Mr. Gray ran the snowmobile down into the ravine, which held a small frozen creek. He drove north along this for the remaining mile to I-95, 200 or 300 yards from the light of the army vehicles. There were only few now, moving slowly in the thickening snow. He stopped long enough to consult the part of Jonesy's mind that it could get at. There were files and files of stuff that couldn't fit into Jonesy's little office stronghold, and Mr. Gray found what he was looking for easily enough. There was no switch to turn off the Arctic Cat's headlight. Mr. Gray swung Jonesy's leg off the snowmobile, looked for a rock, picked it up with Jonesy's right hand, and smashed the headlight dark. Then he remounted and drove on. The Cat's fuel was almost gone, but it was all right. The vehicle had served its purpose. The pipe which carried the creek beneath the turnpike was big enough for the snowmobile, but not for the snowmobile and its rider. Mr. Gray dismounted again. Standing beside the snowmobile, he revved the throttle and sent the machine bumping and yawning into the pipe. It went no more than 10 feet before stopping, but that was far enough to keep it from being seen from the air if the snow lightened, allowing low-level recon. Mr. Gray set Jonesy to climbing up the turnpike embankment. He stopped just shy of the guardrails and lay down on his back. There he was temporarily protected from the worst of the wind. The climb had released a last little cache of endorphins, and Jonesy felt his kidnapper sampling them, enjoying them the way Jonesy himself might have enjoyed a cocktail or a hot drink after watching a football game on a brisk October afternoon. He realized with no surprise that he hated Mr. Gray. Then Mr. Gray was an entity. Something that could actually be hated was gone again, replaced by the cloud Jonesy had first experienced back in the cabin when the creature's head had exploded. It was going out, as it had gone out in search of Emil Brodsky. It had needed dog because the information about how to get the snowmobile started hadn't been in Jonesy's files. Now it needed something else. A ride was the logical assumption. And what was left here? What was left guarding the office when the lush red of Jonesy covered? Jonesy, who had been turned out of his own body like lint out of a pocket. The cloud, of course, the stuff Jonesy had breathed then. Stuff that should have killed him, but for some reason not done so. The cloud couldn't think, not the way Mr. Gray could. The man of the house, who was now Mr. Gray instead of Mr. Jones, had departed, leaving the place under the control of the thermostats, the refrigerator, the stove, and in case of trouble, the smoke detector and the burglar alarm, which automatically dialed the police. Still, with Mr. Gray gone, he might be able to get out of the office. Not to regain control, If he tried that, the red-black cloud would report him and Mr. Gray would return from his scouting expedition at once. Jonesy would almost certainly be seized before he could retreat to the safety of the Tracker Brothers' office, with its bulletin board and its dusty floor and its one dirt-crusted window on the world. Only there were 4 crescent-shaped clean patches in that dirt, weren't there? Patches where 4 boys had once leaned their foreheads, hoping to see the picture that was pinned to the bulletin board now. Tina Jean Schlossinger with her skirt up. No, seizing control was far beyond his ability, and he'd better accept that, bitter as it was. But he might be able to get to the files. Was there any reason to risk it? Any advantage? There might be if he knew what Mr. Gray wanted. Beyond a ride, that was. And speaking of that, a ride where? The answer was unexpected because it came in Duddet's voice. "Oh, I wanna, ow. Mr. Gray wanna go south." Jonesy stepped back from his dirty window on the world. There wasn't much to be seen out there just now, anyway. Snow and dark and shadowy trees. His morning snow had been the appetizer. Here was the main course. Mr. Gray wanna go south. How far and why? What was the big picture? On these subjects, Duddets was silent. Jonesy turned and was surprised to see the route map and the picture of the girl were no longer on the bulletin board, where there had been 4 color snapshots of 4 boys. Each had the same background, Derry Junior High, and on the same caption beneath, School Days 1978. Jonesy himself on the far left, face split in a trusting ear-to-ear grin, now broke his heart. Beeve next to him, the Beeve's grin, revealing the missing tooth in front, victim of a skating fall, which had been replaced by a false one a year or so later. Before high school, anyway. Pete with his broad, olive-tinted face and his shamefully short hair mandated by his father, who hadn't fought in Korea so his kid could look like a hippie. And Henry on the end. Henry in his thick glasses that made Jonesy think of Danny Dunn, boy detective, star of the mysteries Jonesy had read as a kid. Beaver, Pete, Henry. How he had loved them and how unfairly sudden the severing of their long friendship had been. No, it wasn't bit fair. All at once, the picture of Beaver Clarendon came alive, scaring the hell out of Jonesy. Beave's eyes widened as he spoke in a low voice. His head was off, remember? It was laying in the ditch, and his eyes were full of mud. What a fuckero! I mean, Jesus Christ, bananas! Oh my God, Jonesy thought as it came back to him. The one thing about the first hunting trip to Hole in the Wall that had forgotten or suppressed. Had all of them suppressed it? Maybe so. Probably so. Because over the years since, they had talked about everything in their childhoods. All those shared memories, except that one. His head was off. His eyes were full of mud. Something had happened to them then. Something that had to do with what was happening to him now. If only I knew what it was, Jonesy thought. If only I knew. Andy Janis had lost the other 3 trucks in his little squadron. Had gotten ahead of them because they weren't used to driving in shit like this, and he was. He had grown up in northern Minnesota, and you better believe he was used to it. He was by himself in one of Chevrolet's finer army vehicles, a modified 4-wheel drive pickup, and he had the 4-wheel drive engaged tonight. His father hadn't raised any fools. A couple of army plows had gone by an hour or so ago. He would be catching up to them soon, he guessed, and when he did, he would cut speed and fall in behind them like a good boy. And no more than 2 or 3 inches had piled up on the concrete since then. The real problem was the wind, which lifted the fluff and turned the road into a ghost. You had the reflectors to guide you, though. Keeping the reflectors in sight was the trick that those Gomers didn't understand, or maybe with the convoy trucks and the Humvees, the headlights were set too high to pick up the reflectors up properly. And when the wind really gusted, even the reflectors disappeared. The goddamn world went totally white and you had to take your foot off the go pedal until the air stilled again. You just tried to stay on course in the meantime. It would be alright, and if anything happened, he was in radio contact and more plows would be coming up behind, keeping the southbound barrel of the turnpike open all the way from Presque Isle to Millinocket. In the back of his truck were 2 triple-wrapped packages. In one were the bodies of 2 deer which had been killed by the Ripley. In the other, which Janis found moderately too seriously gruesome, was the body of a Grayboy turning slowly into kind of a reddish-orange soup. Both were bound for the docks at Blue Base, which had been set up at a place called. Janis looked up at the driver's visor. There, held in a place by a rubber band, a piece of a notepaper and a ballpoint pen. Scrawled on the paper was Goslin's Store. Take exit 16, turn left. He'd be there in an hour, maybe less. The docs would undoubtedly tell him they had all the animal samples they needed, and the deer carcasses would be burned, but they might want the Grey Boy. But the little fella hadn't turned entirely to mush. The cold night might retard the process a little bit, but whether it did or didn't was really none of Andy Janis's never mind. His concern was to get there, turn over the samples, and then await debriefing from whoever was in charge of asking questions about the Q-Zone's northern and most quiet perimeter. While he was waiting, he would grab some hot coffee and a great big plate of scrambled eggs. If the right someone was around, he might be able to promote something to spike his coffee with. That would be good. Get a little buzz going and then just hunker down and pull over. Janis frowned, shook his head, scratched his ear as if something, a flea perhaps, had bitten him there. Janis frowned, shook his head, scratched his ear as if something, a flea, perhaps, had bitten him there. The goddamn wind gusted hard enough to shake the truck. The turnpike disappeared and so did the reflectors. He was encased in total white again, and he had no doubt that this scared the ever-loving bijabbers out of the other guys, but not him. He was Mr. Minnesota Twins taking care of business. Just pull the old foot off the gas and never mind the brake. When you were driving in a snowstorm, when you are driving in the snowstorm, the brake was the best way. When you are driving in the snowstorm, the brake was the best way he knew to turn a good ride bad. Just coast and wait for pull over. Huh? He looked at the radio, but there was nothing there, just static and dim background chatter. Pull over. Ow! Janis cried and grabbed his head, which suddenly hurt like a motherfucker. The olive green pickup swerved, skidded, and then came back under control as his hands automatically steered into the skid. His foot was still off the gas and the Chevy speedometer needle unwound rapidly. The plows had made a narrow path down the center of the 2 southbound lanes. Now Janis steered into the thicker snow to the right of his path, the truck's wheels spuming up a haze of snow, which the wind quickly whipped away. The guardrail reflectors were very bright, glaring in the dark like cat's eyes. Pull over here! Janis screamed with pain. From a great distance, he heard himself shouting, Okay, I am! Just stop it! Quit yanking me! Through watering eyes, he saw a dark form rear up on the far side of the guardrails, not 50 feet ahead. As the headlights struck the shape fully, he saw it was a man wearing a parka. Andy Janis's hand no longer felt like his own. They felt like gloves with someone else's hands inside them. This was an odd and entirely unpleasant sensation. They turned the steering wheel farther to the left entirely without his help, and the pickup truck coasted to a stop in front of a man in the parka. This was his chance, with Mr. Gray's attention entirely diverted. Jonesy sensed that if he thought about it, he could lose his courage, so he didn't think. He simply acted, knocking back the bolt of the office door with the heel of his hand and yanking the door open. He had never been inside Tracker Brothers as a kid, and it had been gone since the big storm of '85. But he was pretty sure it had never looked like what he saw now. Outside the dingy office was a room so vast Jonesy couldn't see the end of it. Overhead were endless acres of fluorescent bars. Beneath them, stacked in enormous columns, were millions of cardboard boxes. No, Jonesy thought, not millions, trillions. Yes, probably trillions was closer. Thousands of narrow aisles ran between them. He was standing on one edge of eternity's own warehouse, and the idea of finding anything in it was ludicrous. If he ventured away from the door into his office hideout, he would become lost in no time. Mr. Gray wouldn't need to bother with him. Jonesy would wander until he died, lost in a mind-boggling wasteland of stored boxes. That's not true. I could get no more lost in there than I could in my own bedroom. Nor will I have to hunt for what I want. This is my place. Welcome to your own head, big boy. The concept was so huge that it made him feel weak. And he couldn't afford to be weak right now, or to hesitate. Mr. Gray, everyone's favorite invader from the great beyond, wouldn't be occupied with the truck driver for so long. If Jonesy meant to move some of these files to safety, he had to do it right now. The question was, which ones? Duddits, his mind whispered. This has to do something with Duddits. You know it does. He's been on your mind a lot lately. The other guys were thinking of him. Duddits is what held you and Henry and Pete and Beaver together. You've always known that. But now you know something else as well, don't you? Yes. He knew that his accident in March had been caused by thinking he'd seen Duddits once again being teased by Richie Granadu and his friends. Only teased was a ludicrous, inapt word for what was going on behind Tracker Brothers that day, wasn't it? Tortured was the word, and when he had seen that torture being enacted, he had plunged into the street without looking, and his head was off. Beaver suddenly said from the storeroom's overhead speakers, his voice so loud and sudden it made Jonesy cringe. It was laying in the ditch and his eyes were full of mud, and sooner or later every murderer pays the price. What a fuckero! Richie's head. Richie Granadu's head. And Jonesy had no time for this. He was a trespasser in his own head now. And he'd do well to move quickly. When he had first looked out at this enormous storeroom, all the boxes had been plain and unmarked. Now he saw that those in the head of the row closest to him were labeled in black grease pencil. Duddits. Was that surprising? Fortuitous? Not at all. They were his memories after all, stored flat and neatly folded in each of the trillions of boxes when it came to memory. The healthy mind was able to access them pretty much at will. Needs something to move them with, Jonesy thought. And when he looked around, he was not exactly amazed to see a bright red hand dolly. This was a magic place, a make-it-up-as-you-go-along place, and the most marvelous thing about it, Jonesy supposed, was that everybody had one. Moving quickly, he stacked some of the boxes marked Duddits on the dolly and ran them into the Tracker Brothers' office at a trot. He dumped them by tipping the dolly forward, spilling them across the floor, untidy, but he could worry about the good housekeeping seal of approval later. He ran back out, feeling for Mr. Gray, but Mr. Gray was still with the truck driver. Janis, his name was. There was the cloud, but the cloud didn't sense him. It was as dumb as fungus. Jonesy got the rest of the Duddits boxes and saw that the next stack has also acquired scribbled grease pencil labels. These latter said Derry, and there were too many to take. The question was whether or not he needed to take any of them. He pondered this as he pushed the second load of memory boxes into the office. Of course, the Derry boxes would be stacked near the Duddits boxes. Memory was both the act and the art of association. The question remained whether or not his Derry memories mattered. How was he supposed to know that when he didn't know what Mr. Gray wanted? But he did know. Mr. Gray wanna go south. Derry was south. Jonesy sprinted back into the memory storehouse, pushing the dolly ahead of him. He'd take as many of the boxes marked Derry as he could, and hope they were the right ones. He would also hope he sensed Mr. Gray's return in time, because if he was caught out here, he would be swatted like a fly. Janis watched, horrified, as his left hand reached out and opened the driver's side door of the truck, letting in the cold, the snow, and the relentless wind. "Don't hurt me anymore, mister. Please don't. You can have the ride if you want the ride. Just don't hurt me anymore. My head!" Something suddenly rushed through Andy Janis's mind. It was like a whirlwind with eyes. He felt it prying into the current orders, his expected arrival time at Blue Base, of what he knew of Derry, which was nothing. His orders had taken him through Bangor. He'd never been to Derry in his life. He felt the whirlwind pull back, and he had one moment of delirious relief. "I don't have what it needs. It's going to let me go." And then understood that the thing in his mind had no intention of letting him go. It needed the truck for one thing. It needed to shut his mouth for another. Janis put up a brief but bitterly energetic struggle. It was this unexpected resistance that allowed Jonesy time to remove at least one of the stacked boxes marked Derry. Then Mr. Gray once more resumed his place at Janis's motor controls. Janis saw his hand shoot out and up to the driver's side visor. His hand gripped the ballpoint pen and yanked it free, snapping the rubber band which held it. "No!" Janis shouted, but it was too late. He caught a shiny zipping glitter as his hand, which was gripping the ballpoint like a dagger, plunged the pen into his staring eye. There was a popping sound, and he jittered back and forth behind the wheel like a badly managed puppet, his fist digging the pen in deeper and deeper, up to the halfway mark, then to the three-quarter mark. His split eyeball now running down the side of his face like a freakish tear. The tip struck something that felt like a thin gristle, bound up for a moment, then passed through into the meat of his brain. "You bastard," he thought. "What are you, you bastard?" There was a final, brilliant flash of light inside his head, and then everything went dark. Janis slumped forward over the wheel. The pickup's horn began to blow. Mr. Gray hadn't got much from Janis, mostly that unexpected struggle for control at the end. But one thing which came through clearly was that Janis wasn't on his own. The transport column of which he had been a part of had strung out because of the storm, but they were all headed to the same place, which Janis had identified in his mind as both Blue Base and Goslin's. There was a man there that Janis had been afraid of, the man in charge, but Mr. Gray could have not cared less about creepy Kurtz, the boss, crazy ape. Nor did he have to care, since he had no intention of going anywhere near Goslin's store. This place was different, and the species, although only semi-sentient, composed mostly of emotions, was different too. They fought. Mr. Gray had no idea why, but they did. Best to finish it quickly, and to that end, he had discovered an excellent delivery system. Using Jonesy's hand, Mr. Gray pulled Janis from behind the wheel and carried him to the guardrails. He threw the body over the side, not bothering to watch as it tumbled down the slope to the frozen steam bed. He went back to the truck, looked fixedly at the 2 plastic-wrapped bundles in the bag, and nodded. The animal corpses were good for nothing. The other, though, that would be useful. It was rich with what he needed. He looked up suddenly, Jonesy's eyes widening in the blowing snow. The owner of this body was out of its hiding place. Vulnerable. Good. Because that consciousness was starting to annoy him. A constant muttering, sometimes rising to a panicky squeal on the lower level of his thought process. Mr. Gray paused a moment longer, trying to make his mind blank, not wanting Jonesy to have the slightest warning. And then he pounced. He didn't know what he had expected, but not this. Not this dazzling white light. Jonesy was nearly caught out. Would have been caught out if not for the fluorescence with which he had lit his mental storeroom. This place might not actually exist, but it was real enough to him, and it made it real enough for Mr. Gray when Mr. Gray arrived. Jonesy, who was pushing the dolly filled with boxes marked Dairy, saw Mr. Gray appear like magic at the head of a corridor of high-stacked cartons. It was the rudimentary humanoid that had been standing behind him at hole in the wall, the thing he had visited in the hospital. The dull black eyes were finally alive, hungry. It had crept up, caught him outside his office refuge, and it meant to have him. But then its bulge of a head recoiled, and before its 3-fingered hand shielded its eyes, it had no lids, not even lashes. Jonesy saw an expression on its grey sketch of a face that had to be bewilderment, maybe even pain. It had been out there in the snowy dark, disposing of the driver's body. It had come in there unprepared for the discount mart glare. He saw something else too. The invader had borrowed its expression of surprise from the host. For a moment, Mr. Gray was a horrible caricature of Jonesy himself. Its surprise gave Jonesy just enough time, pushing the dolly ahead of him almost without realizing it and feeling like the imprisoned princess in some fucked up fairy tale. He ran into the office. He sensed, rather than saw, Mr. Gray, reaching out for him with his 3-fingered hands. The grey skin was raw-looking, like very old, uncooked meat, and slammed the office door just ahead of their clutch. He bumped the dolly with his bad hip as he spun around. He accepted that he was inside his own head, but all of this was nevertheless completely real, and just managed to run the bolt before Mr. Gray could turn the knob and force his way in. Jonesy engaged the thumb lock in the center of the doorknob for good measure. Had the thumb lock been there before, or had he added it? He couldn't remember. Jonesy stepped back, sweating, and this time ran his butt into the handle of the dolly. In front of him, the doorknob turned back and forth, back and forth. Mr. Gray was out there, in charge of the rest of his mind and his body. But he couldn't get in here, couldn't force the door, didn't have the heft to break it down, didn't have the wit to pick the lock. Why? How could that be? "Duddits," he whispered. "No bounce, no play." The doorknob rattled. "Let me in!" Mr. Gray snarled, and to Jonesy he didn't sound like an emissary from another galaxy, but like anyone who had been denied what he wants and is pissed off about it. Was that because he was interpreting Mr. Gray's behavior in terms of which he, Jonesy, understood? Humanizing the alien, translating him. "Let me in!" Jonesy responded without thinking. "Not by the hair of my chinny chin," and thought, "To which you say, then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in." Then Mr. Gray only rattled the knob harder than ever. He was not used to being balked in this manner, or in any manner, Jonesy guessed, and was very pissed. Janis's momentary resistance had startled him, but this was resistance on a whole other level. "Where are you?" Mr. Gray called angrily. "How can you be in there? Come out!" Jonesy didn't reply, only stood among the tumbled boxes, listening. He was almost positive Mr. Gray couldn't get in, but it would be just as well not to provoke him. And after a little more knob rattling, he sensed Mr. Gray leaving him. Jonesy went to the window, stepping over the tumbled boxes marked Duddits and Derry to get there, and stared out into the snowy night. Mr. Gray climbed Jonesy's body back behind the wheel of the truck. The truck bolted forward and then lost purchase. All four wheels spun and the truck skidded into the guardrails with a jarring bang. "Fuck!" Mr. Gray cried, accessing Jonesy's profanity almost without being aware of it. "Jesus Christ bananas! Kiss my bender! Doodly fuck! Bite my bag!" Then he stopped and accessed Jonesy's driving skills again. Jonesy had some information on driving in weather like this, but nowhere near as much as Janis has possessed. Janis was gone, however, his files erased, which Jonesy knew would have to do. The most important thing was to get beyond what Janis had thought as the Q zone. Beyond the Q zone, he would be safe. Janis had been clear about that. Jonesy's foot pressed down on the gas pedal again, but more gently this time. The truck started to move. Jonesy's hand steered the Chevrolet back into the fading path left by the plow. Under the dash, the radio crackled to life. "Tubby 1, this is Tubby 4. I got a rig off the road and turned over to the median. Do you copy?" Mr. Gray consulted the files. What Jonesy knew about military communication was skimpy, mostly gleaned from books and something called the movies. But it might do. He took the mic, felt the button Jonesy seemed to think would be on the side, found it, pushed it. "I copy," he said. Would Tubby 4 be able to tell Tubby 1 was no longer Andy Janis? Based on Jonesy's file, Mr. Gray doubted it. "A bunch of us are going to get him up. See if you can get him back on the road. He's got the goddamn food. Do you copy?" Mr. Gray pushed the button. "Got the goddamn food. Copy." A longer pause, long enough for him to wonder if he'd said something wrong, stepped in some kind of trap. Then the radio said, "You'll have to wait for the next bunch of plows, I guess. You might as well keep rolling. Over." Tubby 4 sounded disgusted. Jonesy's file suggested that might be because Janis, with his superior driving skills, had gotten too far ahead to help. All this was good. He would have kept moving in any case. But it was good to have Tubby 4's official sanction, if that's what it was. He checked Jonesy's files, which he now saw as Jonesy saw them, boxes in vast room, and said, "Copy, Tubby 1, over and out." And as an afterthought, "Have a nice night." The white stuff was horrible, treacherous nonetheless. Mr. Gray risked driving a little faster. As long as he was in the area controlled by creepy Kurtz armed foes, he might be vulnerable. Once out of the net, however, he would be able to complete his business very quickly. What he needed had to do with a place called Derry. And when Mr. Gray went into the big storeroom again, he discovered an amazing thing. His unwilling host had either known that or sensed it. Because it was Derry's file Jonesy had been moving when Mr. Gray had returned and almost caught him. Mr. Gray searched the boxes that were left with sudden anxiety and then relaxed. What he needed was still there. Lying on its side near the box which contained most important information was another box, very small, very dusty. Written on the side in black pencil was the word Duddits. If there were other Duddits boxes, they had been removed. Only this one had been overlooked. More out of curiosity than anything else, his curiosity also borrowed from Jonesy's store of emotions. Mr. Gray opened it. Inside was a bright yellow container made of plastic. Outlandish figures capered upon it. Figures Jonesy's files identified as both cartoons and the Scooby-Doos. On one end was a sticker reading, "I belong to Duddits Cavell, 19 Maple Lane, Derry, Maine. If the boy I belong to is lost, call." This was followed by numbers too faint and illegible to read. Probably a communication code Jonesy no longer remembered. Mr. Gray tossed the yellow plastic container, probably meant for carrying food, aside. It could mean nothing. Although if that was really the case, why had Jonesy risked his existence getting the other Duddits boxes, as well as some of those marked Derry to safety? Duddits equals childhood friend. Mr. Gray knew this from his initial encounter with Jonesy in the hospital. If he had known what an annoyance Jonesy would turn out to be, he would have erased his host consciousness right then. Neither the term childhood nor the term friend had any emotional resonance to Mr. Gray, but he understood what they meant. What he didn't understand was how Jonesy's childhood friend could have anything to do with what was happening tonight. One possibility occurred to him. His host had gone mad. Being turned out of his own body had driven him insane, and he had simply taken the boxes closest to the door of his perplexing stronghold, assigning them in his madness an importance they did not actually have. "Jonesy," Mr. Gray said, speaking the name with Jonesy's vocal cords. These creatures were mechanical geniuses. Of course they would be, to survive in such a cold world. But their thought processes were awed and crippled. Rusty mentation sunk into corrosive pools of emotion. Their telepathic abilities were minus. The transient telepathy they were now experiencing thanks to the Byrus and the Kim, flashlights they called them, bewildered and frightened them. It was difficult for Mr. Gray to believe they hadn't murdered their entire species yet. Creatures incapable of real thought were maniacs. This was surely beyond argument. Meanwhile, no answer from the creature in that strange, impregnable room. "Jonesy!" Nothing, but Jonesy was listening. Mr. Gray was sure of it. "There is no necessity for this suffering, Jonesy. See us for what we are. Not invaders, but saviors. Buddies." Mr. Gray considered the various boxes. For a creature that couldn't simply think much, Jonesy had an enormous amount of storage capacity. Question for another day. Why would beings who thought so poorly have so much retrieval capability? Did it have to do with their overblown emotional makeup? And the emotions were disturbing. He found Jonesy's emotions very disturbing. Always there, always on call, and so much of them. War, famine, ethnic cleansing, killing for peace, massacring the heathen for Jesus. Homosexual people beaten to death, bugs in bottles, the bottles sitting on top of missiles, aimed at every city in the world. Come on, Jonesy, compared to type 4 anthrax, what's a little virus between friends? Jesus Christ, bananas, you'll be dead in 50 years anyway. This is good. Relax. Enjoy it. You made that guy stick a pen in his eye. Grumpy, but better than nothing. The wind gusted, the pickup skidded, and Mr. Gray rode with it using Jonesy's skills. The visibility was almost nil. He had dropped to 20 miles an hour and might do well to pull over completely for a while once he cleared Kurtz's net. Meanwhile, he could chat with his host. Mr. Gray doubted that he could talk Jonesy out of his room, but chatting at least passed the time. I had to, buddy. I needed the croc. I'm the last one. And you never lose. Right, Mr. Gray agreed. But you never had a situation like this, have you? You never had someone you can't get at. Was Jonesy taunting him? Mr. Gray felt a ripple of anger. And then he said something Mr. Gray had already thought of himself. Maybe you should have killed me in the hospital, or was that only a dream? Mr. Gray, unsure what a dream was, didn't bother responding. having this barricaded mutineer in what by now should have been Mr. Gray's mind, and his alone was increasingly annoying. For one thing, he didn't like thinking of himself as Mr. Gray. That was not his concept of himself or the species mind of which he was a part. He did not even like to think himself as he, for he was both sexes and neither. Yet now he was imprisoned by these concepts and would be as long as the core being of Jonesy remained unabsorbed. A terrible thought occurred to Mr. Gray. What if it was his concepts that had no meaning? He hated being in this position. Who's done it, Jonesy? No answer. Who is Richie? Why was he a shit? Why did you kill him? We didn't. A little tremble in the mental voice. That shot had gone home, and something interesting. Mr. Gray had meant you in the singular, but Jonesy had taken it in the plural. You did, though, or you think you did. That's a lie. How silly of you to say so. I have memories right here in one of your boxes. There is snow in the box, and snow and a moccasin, brown suit. Come out and look. For one giddy second he thought Jonesy might just do that. If he did, Mr. Gray would sweep him back to the hospital at once. Jonesy could see himself die on television, a happy ending to the movie they had been watching, and then no more Mr. Gray. Just what Jonesy thought of as the cloud. Mr. Gray looked eagerly at the doorknob, willing it to turn. It didn't. Come out! Nothing. You killed Richie, you coward. You and your friends. You dreamed him to death. And although Mr. Gray didn't know what dreams were, he knew that was true, or what Jonesy believed it was. Nothing. Come out. Come out, and he heard Jonesy's memories. Many of them were in boxes called movies. Jonesy seemed to love movies above all things, and Mr. Gray plucked what he thought a particularly potent line from one of these. And fight like a man. You bastard, Mr. Gray thought, once more dipping into the enticing pool of host emotions. You son of a bitch. You stubborn asshole. Kiss my bender, you stubborn asshole. Back in the days when Jonesy had been Jonesy, he had often expressed anger by slamming his fist down on something. Mr. Gray did it now, bringing Jonesy's fist down to the center of the truck's wheel hard enough to honk the horn. Tell me, not about Richie, not about Deadits, about you. Something makes you different. I want to know what it is. No answer. It's in the crib. Is that it? Still no answer, but Mr. Gray heard Jonesy's feet shuffle behind the door, and perhaps a low intake of breath. Mr. Gray smiled with Jonesy's mouth. Talk to me, Jonesy. We'll play the game. We'll pass the time. Who was Richie? Beside number 19. Why were you angry with him? Because he was a tiger? A dairy tiger? What were they? Whose Deadits? Nothing. The truck crept more slowly than ever through the storm, the headlights almost helpless against the swirling wall of white. Mr. Gray's voice was low and coaxing. You missed one of the Deadits boxes, buddy. Did you know that? There's a box inside the box. As it happens, it's yellow. There are Scooby-Doos on it. What are Scooby-Doos? They're not real people, are they? Are they movies? Are they televisions? Do you want the box? Come out, Jonesy. Come out and I'll give you the box. Mr. Gray removed his foot from the gas pedal and let the truck coast slowly to the left, over into the thickest snow. Something was happening here, and he wanted to turn all his attention to it. Force has not dislodged Jonesy from his stronghold, but force wasn't the only way to win the battle or the war. The truck stood idling by the guardrails in what was now a full-fledged blizzard. Mr. Gray closed his eyes. Immediately he was in Jonesy's brightly lit memory storehouse. Behind him were miles of stacked boxes, marching away under the fluorescent tubes. In front of him was the closed door, shabby and dirty and for some reason very strong. Mr. Gray placed his 3-finger hands on it and began to speak in a low voice that was both intimate and urgent. "Who is Duddits? Why did you call him after you killed Richie? Let me in, we need to talk. Why did you take some of the dairy boxes? What did you not want me to see? It doesn't matter, I have what I need. Let me in, Jonesy. Better now than later." It was going to work. He sensed Jonesy's blank eyes, could see Jonesy's hand moving toward the knob and the lock. "We always win," Mr. Gray said. He sat behind the wheel with Jonesy's eyes closed, and in another universe, the wind screamed and rocked the truck on its springs. "Open the door, Jonesy. Open it now." Silence, and then from less than 3 inches away, as surprising as a basin full of cold water dashed on warm skin. "Eat shit and die!" Mr. Gray recoiled so violently that the back of Jonesy's head connected with the truck's rear window. The pain was sudden and shocking, a second unpleasant surprise. He slammed a fist down again, then the other, then the first once more. He was hammering on the wheel, the horn beating out a Morse code of rage. A largely motionless creature and part of a largely motionless species, he had been hijacked by his host's emotional juices. Not just dipping in them this time, but bathing. And again, he sensed this was happening because Jonesy was still there, an unquiet tumor in what would have been a serene and focused consciousness. Mr. Gray hammered on the wheel, hating his emotional ejaculation, what Jonesy's mind identified as a tantrum, but loving it too. Loving the sound of the horn when he hit it with Jonesy's fists, loving the beat of Jonesy's blood in Jonesy's temple, loving the way Jonesy's heart sped up and the sound of Jonesy's hoarse voice crying, "You fuckhead! You fuckhead!" over and over and over. And even in the midst of this rage, a cold part of him realized what the true danger was. They always came. They always made the worlds they visited overrun their image. It was the way things had always been, the way they were meant to be. But now, something's happening to me, Mr. Gray thought, aware, even as the thought came, that it was essentially a Jonesy thought. I'm starting to be human. The fact that the idea was not without its attractions filled Mr. Gray with horror. Jonesy came out of the doze, where the only sound was the soothing, lulling rhythm of Mr. Gray's voice, and saw that his hands were resting on the locks of the office door, ready to turn the lower and draw the bolt on the upper. The son of a bitch was trying to hypnotize him, and doing a pretty good job of it. "We always win," said the voice on the other side of the door. It was soothing, which was nice after a stressful day, but it was also wildly complacent. The usurper who would not rest until he had it all, who took getting it all as a given. "Open the door, Jonesy. Open it now." For a moment, he almost did it. He was awake again, but he almost did it anyway. Then he remembered two sounds. The tenebrous creak of Pete's skull as the red stuff tightened on it, and the wet squittering Janis's eye had made when the tip of the pen pierced it. Jonesy realized he hadn't been awake at all. Not really. Now he was. Dropping his hands away from the lock and putting his lips to the door, he said, "Eat shit and die!" In his clearest voice. He felt Mr. Gray recoil. He even felt the pain when Mr. Gray thumped back against the window, and why not? They were his nerves after all, not to mention his head. Few things in his life gave him so much pleasure as Mr. Gray's outraged surprise, that he vaguely realized what Mr. Gray already knew. The alien presence in his head was more human now. If you could come back as a physical entity, would you still be Mr. Gray? Jonesy wondered. He didn't think so. Mr. Pink maybe, but not Mr. Gray. He didn't know if the guy would try his Muzor Mesmer routine again, but Jonesy decided to take no chances. He turned and went to the office window, tripping over one of the boxes and stepping over the rest. Christ, his hip hurt. It was crazy to feel such pain when you were imprisoned in your head. When you were imprisoned in your own head, which Henry had once assured him had no nerves anyway, at least once you got into the old grey matter. But the pain was there all right. He had read that amputees sometimes felt horrible agonies and unscratchable itches in limbs that no longer existed. Probably this was the same deal. The window had returned to a tiresome view of the weedy, double-rutted driveway, which had run alongside the Tracker Brothers depot back in 1978. The sky was white and overcast. Apparently, when this window looked into the past, time was frozen at mid-afternoon. The only thing the view had to recommend it was that, as he stood there taking it in, Jonesy was far from Mr. Gray as he could possibly get. He guessed he could change the view if he really wanted to. Could look out and see what Mr. Gray was currently seeing with the eyes of Gary Jones. He had no urge to do that, however. There was nothing to look at but the snowstorm. Nothing to feel but Mr. Gray's stolen rage. Think of something else, he told himself. What? I don't know anything. Why not? On the desk, the telephone rang. And that was odd on an Alice in Wonderland scale, because a few minutes ago there had been no telephone in the room and no desk for it to sit on. The litter of old-used rubbers had disappeared. The floor was still dirty, but the dust on the tiles had gone. Apparently there was some sort of janitor inside his head, a neatnik who had decided Jonesy was going to be here for a while, so the place ought to be at least tolerably clean. He found the concept awesome, the implications depressing. On the desk, the phone shrilled again. Jonesy picked up the receiver and said, "Hello?" Beaver's voice sent a sick and horrible chill down his back. A telephone call from a dead man. It was the stuff of the movies he had liked anyway. His head was off, Jonesy. He was lying in the ditch and his eyes were full of mud. There was a click, then silence. Jonesy hung up the phone and walked back to the window. The driveway was gone. Derry was gone. He was looking at the hole in the wall under a pale, clear, early morning sky. The roof was black instead of green, which meant this was hole in the wall as it had been before 1982. When four of them, then strapping high school boys, when Henry had never been what you'd call strapping, had helped Beeve's dad put up the green shingles the camp still wore. Only Jonesy needed no such landmark to know what time it was. No more than he needed someone to tell him the green shingles were no more. The hole in the wall was no more. Henry had burned it to the ground. In a moment, the door opened and Beaver would run out. It was 1978, the year all this had really started. And in a moment, Beaver would run out, wearing only his boxer shorts and his many-zippered motorcycle jacket. The orange bandanas fluttering. It was 1978. They were young and they had changed. No more same shit, different day. This was the day when they began to realize just how much they had changed. Jonesy stared out of the window, fascinated. The door opened. Beaver Clarendon, age 14, ran out. Henry watched Underhill trudge toward him in the glare of the security lights. Underhill's head was bent against the snow and the intensifying wind. Henry opened his mouth to call out, but before he could, he was overwhelmed, nearly flattened by a sense of Jonesy. Then a memory came, blotting out Underhill and this brightly lit, snowy world completely. All at once it was 1978 again, not October, but November, and there was blood. Blood on cattails, broken glass and marshy water, and then the bang on the door. Henry awakes from a terrible, confused dream. Blood, broken glass, the rich smells of gasoline and burning rubber, to the sound of a banging door and a blast of cold air. He sits up and sees Pete sitting up beside him. Pete's hairless chest covered with goosebumps. Henry and Pete are on the floor in their sleeping bags because they lost the four-way toss. Beav and Jonesy got the bed. Later, there will be a third bedroom in the hole in the wall, but now there are only two and Lamar has one to himself by the divine right of adulthood. Only now Jonesy is alone in the bed, also sitting up, also looking confused and frightened. "Scooby-Dooby-Doo, where are you?" Henry thinks of no appreciable reason as he gropes for his glasses on the windowsill. In his nose, he can still smell gas and burning tires. "Got some work to do now." "Crashed," Jonesy says thickly and throws back the covers. His chest is bare, but like Henry and Pete, he wore his socks and long john bottoms to bed. "Yeah, I went in the water," Pete says, his face suggesting he doesn't have the slightest idea what he's talking about. "Henry got a shoe. Moccasin," Henry says, but he hasn't had any idea what he's talking about either, nor wants to. "Beav," Jonesy says and gets out of the bed in a clumsy lunge. One of the stocking-clad feet comes down on Pete's hand. "Ow!" Pete cries. "You stepped on me, you fucking Gomer! Watch where you—" "Shut up, shut up!" Henry says, grabbing Pete's shoulder and giving it a shake. "Don't wake up Mr. Clarendon." Which would be easy because the door of the boys' bedroom is open. And so is the door on the far side of the big central room, the one on the outside. No wonder they are cold. There's a hell of a draft. Now that Henry has his eyes back on, that is how he thinks of it. He can see the Dreamcatcher out there dancing in the cold November breeze coming in through the open door. "Where's Duddits?" Jonesy asks in a dazed, "I'm still dreaming" voice. "Did he go out with Beaver?" "He's back in Derry, foolish," Henry says, getting up and pulling up his thermal undershirt. And he doesn't feel that Jonesy is foolish, not really. He also has a sense that Duddits was just here with them. It was the dream, he thinks. Duddits was in the dream. He was sitting on the bank. He was crying. He was sorry. He didn't mean to. If anyone meant to, it was us. And there is still crying. He can hear it, coming in through the front door, carried on the breeze. It's not Duddits, though. It's the beef. They leave the room in a line, putting on scraps of clothes as they go, not bothering with their shoes, which would take too long. One good thing, judging from the density of beer cans on the kitchen table, plus a suburb of same on the coffee table, it takes more than a couple of open doors and some whispering kids to wake up Beaver's dad. The big granite doorstep is freezing under Henry's stocking feet. Cold in the deep, thoughtless way death must be cold, but he barely notices. He sees the Beaver right away. He's at the foot of the maple tree with the deer stand in it, on his knees as if praying. His legs and feet are bare, Henry sees. He's wearing his motorcycle jacket, and tied up and down his arms, fluttering like pirate's finery, are the orange bandanas his father made his son wear when Beaver insisted on wearing such a damned foolish, unhunterly thing in the woods. The outfit looks pretty funny, but there's nothing funny about that agonized face tilted up towards the maple's nearly bare branches. The beef's cheeks are streaming with tears. Henry breaks into a run. Pete and Jonesy follow suit. their breath puffing white in the chill morning air. The needle-strewn ground under Henry's feet is almost as hard and cold as the granite doorstep. He drops to his knees beside Beaver, scared and somehow awed by those tears. Because Beaver isn't just misting up, like the hero of the movie who may be followed to shed a manly drop or two when his dog or girlfriend dies. Beaver's running like Niagara Falls. From his nose hang 2 ropes of clear, glistening snot. You never saw stuff like that in the movies. "Gross," Pete says. Henry looks at him impatiently, but then he sees Pete isn't looking at Beaver but past him, at a steaming puddle of vomit. In it are kernels of last night's corn. Lamar Clarendon believes passionately in the virtues of canned food when it comes to camp cooking, and strings of last night's fried chicken. Henry's stomach makes a big unhappy lurch. And just as it starts to settle, Jonesy yarks. The sound is like a big liquid belch. The puke is brown. "Gross!" Pete almost screams it this time. Beaver doesn't seem to even notice. "Henry," he says, his eyes submerged beneath twin lenses of tears, are huge and spooky. They seem to peer past Henry's face and into the supposedly private rooms behind his forehead. "Beav, it's okay, you had a bad dream." "Sure, a bad dream." Jonesy's voice was thick, his throat still plated with puke. He tries to clear it with a thick, retching voice that is somehow worse than what just came out of him, then bends over and spits. His hands are planted on the legs of his long handles, and his bare back is covered with bumps. Beav takes no notice of Jonesy, nor of Pete as Pete kneels down on his other side and puts a clumsy, tentative arm around Beav's shoulder. Beav continues to look only at Henry. "His head was off," Beaver whispers. Jonesy also drops to his knees, and now all 3 of them are surrounding the Beav. Henry and Pete on either side, Jonesy in front. There is vomit on Jonesy's chin. He reaches to wipe it away, but Beaver takes his hand before he can. The boys kneel beneath the maple, and suddenly they are all one. It is brief, this sense of union, but as vivid as their dream. It is their dream, but now they are all awake. The sensation is rational, and they cannot disbelieve. Now it is Jonesy, the Beav is looking at with his spooky swimming eyes. Clutching Jonesy's hand. "It was lying in the ditch, and his eyes were full of mud." "Yeah," Jonesy whispers in an odd and shaky voice. "Oh jeez, it was. Said he'd see us again, remember?" He does. "One at a time or all together." He said that. Henry hears all these things from a great distance, because he's back in the dream, back in the scene of the accident, at the bottom of the trash-littered embankment where there is a soggy piece of marsh created by blocked drainage culvert. He knows the place. He knows the place. It's on Route 7, the old Derry Newport Road. Lying overturned in the muck and in the murk is a burning car. The air stinks of gas and burning tires. Durrett is crying. Durrett is sitting halfway down the trashy slope and holding his yellow Scooby-Doo lunchbox against his chest and crying his eyes out. The hand protrudes from one of the windows of the overturned car. It's slim, the nails painted candy apple red. The car's other 2 occupants have been thrown clear, one of them almost 30 damn feet. This one's face down, but Henry still recognizes him by the masses of soaked blonde hair. It's Duncan, the one who said you're not gonna tell anyone anything because you'll be fucking dead." Only Duncan's the one who wound up dead. Something floats against Henry's shin. Don't pick that up," Pete says urgently, but Henry does. It's a brown suede moccasin. He was just in time to register this, and then Beaver and Jonesy shriek in terrible childish harmony. They were standing together, ankle-deep in the muck, both of them wearing their hunting clothes, Jonesy in his new bright orange parka, bought special from Sears for this trip, and Mrs. Jones still tearfully, unpersuadably convinced that his son will be killed in the woods by a hunter's bullet, cut down in his prime. Beaver in his tattered motorcycle jacket. What a lot of zippers! Duddy's mom had said admiringly, thus winning Beaver's love and admiration forever. With the orange bandanas tied up and down the arms. They aren't looking at the third body, the one lying just outside the driver's door, but Henry does, for a moment still holding the moccasin like a waterlogged canoe in his hands. Because something is terribly, fundamentally wrong with it. So wrong that for a moment he cannot tell what it might be. Then he realizes there's something above the collar of the corpse's high school jacket. Beaver and Jonesy are screaming because they have seen what should have been above it. They have seen Richie Granadou's head, lying face up, glaring at the sky from a blood-splattered stand of cattails. Henry knows it's Richie at once. Even though the swatch of tape no longer rides the bridge of his nose, there is no mistaking the guy who was trying to feed Duddits is a piece of shit that day behind trackers. Duddits is up there on the bank, crying and crying, that crying that gets into your head like a sinus headache. And if it goes on, it will drive Henry mad. He drops the Mawkins logs around the back of the burning car to where Beaver and Jonesy stand with their arms around each other. "Beaver! Beav!" Henry shouts, but until he reaches out and gives Beaver a hard shake, Beaver just continues to stare at the severed head, as if hypnotized. Finally, though, Beaver looks at him. His head's off, he says, as if this were not evident. "Henry, his head's..." "Never mind his head. Take care of Duddit. Make him stop that goddamn crying." "Yes," Pete says. He looks at Richie's head, that final dead glare, then looks away, mouth twitching. "It's driving me fucking buckshit." "Like chalk on a chalkboard," Jonesy mutters. Above his new orange parka, his skin is the color of old cheese. "Make him stop, Beav!" "Don't be a dweeb. Sing him the fucking song!" Henry shouts. He can feel mucky water oozing up between his toes. The lullaby, the goddamn lullaby! For a moment, the Beav looks as though he still doesn't understand. But then his eyes clear a little and he says, "Oh!" He goes slogging down the embankment where Duddit sits, clutching his bright yellow lunchbox and howling, as he did on the day they met him. Henry sees something that he barely has time to notice. There is a blood caked around Duddit's nostrils, and there is a bandage on the left shoulder. Something is poking out of it, something that looks like white plastic. "Duddits," the Beav says, climbing the embankment. "Daddy, honey, no, don't cry no more. Don't look at it no more. It's not for you to look at. It's so fucking gross." At first, Duddits takes no notice, goes on howling. Henry thinks. He cries himself to a nosebleed. That's the blood part. What's that white thing sticking out of his shoulder? Jonesy has actually raised his hands to cover his ears. Pete has got one on top of his head, as if to keep it from blowing off. Then Beaver takes Duddits in his arms, as he did a few weeks earlier, and begins to sing in that high, clear voice that you'd never think would come out of the scrub like the Beav. "Baby's boat a silver dream, sailing near and far." And oh miracle of blessed miracles, Duddits begins to quiet. Speaking from the corner of his mouth, Pete says, "Where are we, Henry? Where the fuck are we?" "In a dream," Henry says, and all at once, all four of them are back under the maple tree at the hole in the wall, kneeling together in their underwear and shivering in the cold. "What?" Jonesy says. He pulls free to wipe his mouth, and then the contact among them breaks. Reality comes all the way back. "What did you say, Henry?" Henry feels the withdrawal of their minds, actually feels it, and he thinks, "We weren't meant to be like this, none of us. Sometimes being alone is better."
Yes, alone with your thoughts. I had a bad dream, Beaver says. He seems to be explaining this to himself rather than to the rest of them. Slowly, as if he was still dreaming, he unzips one of his jacket pockets, rummages around inside, and comes out with a Tootsie Pop. Instead of unwrapping it, Beaver puts the stick end in his mouth and begins to roll it back and forth, nipping and gnawing lightly. I dreamed that... Never mind, Henry says and pushes his glasses up to his nose. We all know what you dreamed. We ought to. We were there. Trembles on his lips, but he keeps it inside. He's only 14, but wise enough to know what is said cannot be unsaid. When it's laid, it's played. They say when they are playing rummy or crazy eights and someone makes a goofy-ass discard. If he says it, he'll have to deal with it. If he doesn't, then maybe, just maybe, it'll go away. I don't think it was your dream anyhow, Pete says. I think it was Duddit's dream, and be all, I don't give a shit what you think, Jonesy says, his voice so harsh it startles them all. It was a dream, and I'm going to forget it. We are all going to forget it, aren't we, Henry? Henry nods at once. Let's go back in, Pete says. He looks vastly relieved. My feet are free. One thing though, Henry says, and they look at him nervously. Because when they need a leader, Henry it is. And if you don't like the way I do it, he says resentfully, someone else can do it because this is no tit job, believe me. What? Beaver asks, meaning, what now? When we go to Goslin's later on, someone's got to call Duds, in case he's upset. No one replies to this, all of them awed to silence by the idea of calling their new retardo friend on the phone. It occurs to Henry that Duddits was likely never received a phone call in his life. This will be the first. You know, you're probably right, Pete agrees, and then slaps his hand over his mouth like someone who has said something incriminating. Beaver, naked except for his dopey boxers and even dopier jacket, is now shivering violently. The Tootsie Pop jitters at the end of its gnawed stick. Someday you'll choke on one of those things, Henry tells him. Yeah, that's what my mom says. Can we go in? I'm freezing. They start back toward a hole in the wall, where their friendship will end 23 years from this very day. Is Richie Granado really dead, do you think? Beaver asks. I don't know and I don't care, Jonesy says. He looks at Henry. You'll call Duddits, okay? I've got a phone and we can bill the charges to my number. On your phone, Pete says. You lucky duck. Your folks spoil you to fucking rotten, Gary. Calling him Gary usually gets under his skin. But not this morning. Jonesy is too preoccupied. It was for my birthday and I have to pay the long distance out of my allowance. So let's keep it short. And after that, this never happened. Never happened, you got that? And they all nod. Never happened. Never fucking happened. A gust of wind pushed Henry forward, almost in the electrified compound fence. He came back to himself, shaking off the memory like a heavy coat. It couldn't have come at a more inconvenient time, because the time for some memories was never convenient. He had been waiting for Underhill, freezing his katukis off and waiting for his only chance to get out of here. And Underhill could have walked right by him while he stood daydreaming, leaving him up shit creek without a paddle. Only Underhill hadn't gone past. He was standing on the other side of the fence, hands in his pockets, looking at Henry. Snowflakes landed on the transparent bug-like bulb of the mask he wore, were melted by the warmth of his breath, and ran down his surface like Beaver's tears that day, Henry thought. You ought to go to the barn with the rest of them, Underhill said. You'll turn into a snowman out here. Henry's tongue was stuck to the roof of his mouth. His life quite literally depended on what he said to this man. And he could think of no way to get started. Couldn't even loosen his tongue. And why bother? The voice inside inquired. The voice of the darkness, his old friend. Really and truly, why bother? Why not just let them do what you were doing to do to yourself anyway? Because it wasn't just him anymore. And yet he couldn't speak. Underhill stood where he was at the moment longer, looking at him, hands in pocket. Hood thrown back to expose his short, dark blonde hair. Snow melting on the mask. The soldiers wore and the detainees did not, because the detainees would not be needing them. For the detainees, as for the Grayboys, there was a final solution. Henry struggled to speak and could not. Oh God, it should have been Jonesy here, not him. Jonesy had always been better with his mouth, leaving him with a lot of could have beens and might have beens. But Underhill stayed a moment longer. Not surprised you knew my name, Mr. Henry. Is it your name, Henry? Devlin, it's my first name you're picking up. I'm Henry Devlin. Moving very carefully, Henry thrust his hand through the gap between the strand of barbed wire and one of the electrified smooth wire. After Underhill did nothing but look at it expressionlessly for 5 seconds or so, Henry pulled his hand back to the part of the newly drawn world, feeling foolish and telling himself not to be such an idiot. It wasn't as if he had been snubbed at a cocktail party. Once that was done, Underhill nodded pleasantly as if they were at a cocktail party instead of out here in a shrieking storm, illuminated by the newly installed security lights. You knew my name because the alien presence in Jefferson Tract has caused a low-level telepathic effect. Underhill smiled. Sounds silly when you say it right out, doesn't it? But it's true. The effect is transient, harmless, and too shallow to be good for except party games. And we're a little too busy tonight for those. Henry's tongue came finally, blessedly, unstuck. You didn't come over here in a snowstorm because I knew your name, Henry said. You came over here because I knew your wife's name and your daughter's. Underhill smiled and faltered. Maybe I did, he said. In any case, I think it's time we both got undercover and got some rest. It's been a long day. Underhill began walking, but his way took him alongside the fence, toward the other parked trailers and campers. Henry kept pace, although he had to work in order to do it. There was nearly a foot of snow on the ground now, which was drifting, and no one had trampled it down here on the dead man's side. Mr. Underhill, Owen, stop a minute and listen to me. I've got something important to tell you. Underhill kept walking along the path of his side of the fence, which was also Dead Man's side. Did Underhill not know that? Head down against the wind, still wearing that faintly pleasant smile. And the awful thing, Henry knew, was that Underhill wanted to stop. It was just that Henry had not, so far, given him a reason to do so. Kurtz is crazy, Henry said. He was still keeping pace, but he was panting audibly now, his exhausted legs screaming. But he's crazy like a fox. Underhill kept walking, head down and little smile in place under the idiotic mask. If anything, he walked faster. Soon Henry would have to run in order to keep up on his side of the fence, if running was still possible for him. You'll turn the machine guns on us, Henry panted. Bodies go in the barn. Barn gets doused with gasoline, probably from Old Man Gosselin's own pump. Why waste government issue and then ploof, up in smoke, 200, 400, it'll smell like a VFW pig roast in hell. Underhill's smile was gone and he walked faster still. Henry somehow found the strength to trot, gasping for air and fighting his way through knee-high snow dunes. The wind was keen against his throbbing face like a blade. But Owen, that's you, right? Owen, you remember that old rhyme? The one that goes, big fleas got little fleas to bite them, and so on, and
so on ad infinitum. That's there, and that's you, because Kurtz has got his own cadre, the man under him. I think his name is Johnson.
Underhill gave him a single sharp look, then walked faster than ever. Henry somehow managed to keep up, but he didn't think he would be able to much longer. He had a stitch in his side. It was hot and getting hotter.
That was supposed to be your job, the second part of the cleanup. Imperial Valley, that's the code name. Mean anything to you?
Henry saw it didn't. Kurtz must have never told Underhill about the operation that could wipe out most of the Blue Group. Imperial Valley meant exactly squat to Owen Underhill. And now, in addition to the stitch, Henry had what it felt like an iron band around his chest, squeezing and squeezing.
Stop! Jesus, Underhill, can't you?
Underhill just kept striding along. Underhill wanted to keep his last few illusions. Who could blame him?
Johnson, a few others, at least. There's a woman. Could have been you too, if you hadn't fucked up. You crossed the line, that's what he thinks. Not the first time either. You did it before, someplace like Bossa Nova.
That earned Henry a sudden sharp look. Progress? Maybe.
In the end, I think even Johnson goes. Only Kurtz leaves here alive. The rest, nothing but a pile of ashes and bones. Your fucking telepathy doesn't tell you that, does it? Your little parlor trick, mind reading, won't even fucking touch that.
The stitch in his side deepened and sank into his right armpit like a claw. At the same time, the feet slipped and he went flailing headfirst into a snowdrift. His lungs tore furiously for air and instead got a great gasp of powdery snow. Henry flailed to his knees, coughing and choking, and saw Underhill's back just disappearing into the wall of blowing snow. But not knowing what he was going to say, knowing only it was his last chance, he screamed.
You tried to piss on Mr. Rapelow's toothbrush, and when you couldn't do that, you broke their plate and ran away. Just like you're running away now, you fucking coward.
Ahead of him, barely visible in the snow, Owen Underhill stopped. For a moment he only stood there, his back to Henry, who knelt panting like a dog in the snow, with melting icy water running down his burning face. Henry was aware, in a way that was both distant and immediate, from the scratch on his leg where the Byrus was growing and began to itch. At last, Underhill turned around and came back.
How do you know about Rapelow's? The telepathy is fading. You shouldn't be able to get that deep.
I know a lot, Henry said. He got to his feet, then stood there, gasping and coughing.
Because it runs deep in me. I am different. My friends and I, we are all different. There were 4 of us. 2 are dead. I'm in here, the 4th one, Mr. Underhill. The 4th one is your problem, not me, not the people you've got in the barn, or the ones you're still bringing in, not your Blue Group or Kurtz Imperial Valley cadre. Only him.
He struggled, not wanting to say the name. Jonesy was the one whom he had been the closest. Beaver and Pete were great, but only Jonesy could run with him, mind for mind, book for book, idea for idea. Only Jonesy also had the knack of dreaming outside the lines as well as seeing the line. But Jonesy was gone, wasn't he? Henry was quite sure of that. He had been there, a tiny bit of him had been there when the red-black cloud passed Henry. By now, his old friend would have been eaten alive. His heart might still beat and his eyes might still see, but the essential Jonesy was dead as Pete and the Beef.
Jonesy is your problem, Mr. Underhill. Gary Jones of Brookline, Massachusetts. Kurtz is a problem too.
Underhill spoke too softly to be heard over the howling wind, but Henry heard him anyway, heard him in his mind. Underhill looked around.
Henry followed the shift of his head and saw a few men running down the makeshift avenue between the campers and trailer boxes. No one close. Yet the entire area around the store and the barn was mercilessly bright, and even with the wind he could hear revving engines, the stuttery roar of generators, and men yelling. Someone was giving orders through a bullhorn. The overall effect was eerie, as if the two of them had been trapped by the storm in a place filled with ghosts. The running men even looked like ghosts as they faded into the dancing sheets of snow. "We can't talk here," Underhill said. "Listen to me and don't make me repeat a single word, Buck." And in Henry's head, where there was now much more input than most of it was tangled into an incomprehensible stew, a thought from Owen Underhill's mind suddenly rose clear and plain. Buck. His word. I can't believe I used his word. "I'm listening," Henry said. The shed was on the far side of the compound, as far as from the barn as it could possibly get, and although outside was brilliantly lit as the rest of the hellish concentration camp, the inside was dark and smelled sweetly of old hay and something else, something little more acrid. There were 4 men and a woman sitting with their backs against the shed's far wall. They were all dressed in orange hunting togs and they were passing a joint. There were only 2 windows in the shed, one facing in toward the corral, the other facing out toward the perimeter fence and the woods beyond. The glass was dirty and cut the merciless white glare of the sodium lights a little. In the dimness, the faces of the pot-smoking prisoners looked grey, dead already. "You want a hit?" the one with the joint asked. He spoke in a strained, miserly voice, holding the smoke in, but he held the joint out willingly enough. It was a bomber, Henry saw, big as a panatella. "No, I want you all to get out of here." They looked at him, uncomprehending. The woman was married to the man currently holding the joint. The guy on the left was her brother-in-law. The other 2 were just along for the ride. "Go back to the barn," Henry said. "No way," one of the other men said. "Too crowded in there. We prefer to be more exclusive. And since we were here first, I suggest if you don't want to be sociable, you should be the one to." "I've got it," Henry said. He put a hand on his t-shirt knotted around his leg. "Byrus, what they call Ripley. Some of you have it. I think you do, Charles." He pointed at the 5th man, burly in his parka and balding. "No!" Charles cried, but the others were already scrambling away from him, the one with the Cambodian cigar. His name was Darren Childs, and he was from Newton, Massachusetts, being careful to hold on to his smoke. "Yeah, you do," Henry said. "Major League, so do you. Mona? No. Marsha. It's Marsha." I don't," she said. She got up, pressing her back against the shed wall and looking at Henry with large, terrified eyes. Doe's eyes. Soon all the does up here would be dead, and Marsha would be dead as well. Henry hoped she could not see that thought in his mind. "I'm clean, mister. We're all clean in here, except you." She looked at her husband, who was not big, but bigger than Henry. They were all, actually, not taller maybe, but bigger. "Throw him out there." "There are 2 types of Ripley," Henry said, stating as fact what he only believed, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. "Call them Ripley Prime and Ripley Secondary. I'm pretty sure that if you didn't get a hot dose in something you ate or inhaled or something that went live into an open wound, you can get better. You can beat it." Now they were all looking at him with those big doe eyes, and Henry felt a moment of surpassing despair. Why couldn't he just have a nice, quiet suicide? "I've got Ripley Prime," he said. He unknotted the t-shirt. None of them would do more than glance at the rip in Henry's no-powder jeans. But Henry took a good big look for all of them. The wound made by the turn signal stalk had now filled up with Byrus. Some of the strands were 3 inches long, their tips wavering like kelp in a tidal current. He could feel the roots of the stuff working in steadily, deeper and deeper, itching and foaming and fizzing, trying to think. That was the worst of it. It was trying to think. Now they were moving toward the shed door, and Henry expected them to bolt as soon as they caught a clear whiff of the cold air. Instead, they paused. "Mister, can you help us?" Marcia asked in a trembling child's voice. Darren, her husband, put his arm around her. "I don't know," Henry said. "Probably not, but maybe. Go on now. I'll be out here in half an hour, maybe less, but probably it's best for you if you stay in the barn with the others." "Why?" asked Darren Childs from Newton. And Henry, who had only a ghost of an idea, nothing resembling a plan, said, "I don't know, I just think it is." They went out, leaving Henry in possession of the shed. Beneath the window facing the perimeter fence was an ancient bale of hay. Darren Childs had been sitting on it when Henry came in. As the one with the dope, Childs had rated the most comfortable seat, and now Henry took his place. He sat with his hands on his knees, feeling immediately sleepy in spite of the voices tumbling around in his head and the deep spreading itch in his left leg. It was starting in his mouth as well, where he had lost one of his teeth. He heard Underhill coming before Underhill actually spoke from outside the window. Heard the approach of his mind. "I'm in the lee of the wind and mostly in the shadow of the building," Underhill said. "I'm having a smoke. If someone comes along, you're not in there." "Okay. Lie to me. I'll walk away and you'll never in your short life speak to me again, out loud or otherwise." "Okay. How did you get rid of those people in there?" "Why?" Henry would have said he was too tired to be angry, but that seemed not to be the case. Was it some kind of goddamn test? "Don't be a jerk. I told them I've got Ripley Prime, which is the truth. They scattered in a hurry." Henry paused. "You've got it too, don't you?" "What makes you think so?" Henry could detect no strain in Underhill's voice, and as a psychiatrist, he was familiar with the signs. Whatever else Underhill might be, Henry had an idea that he was a man with a tremendously cool head, and that was a step in the right direction. Also, he thought, it can't hurt if he understands he really has nothing to lose. "It's around your fingernails, isn't it? And a little in one ear?" "You'd wow them in Vegas, buddy." Henry saw Underhill's hand go up, with a cigarette between the gloved fingers. He guessed the wind would end up smoking most of that one. "You get primary direct from the source. I'm pretty sure secondary comes from touching something that's growing in tree, moss, deer, dog, another person. You catch that kind like you catch poison ivy. This isn't anything your own medical technicians don't know. For all I can tell, I got the information from them. My head's like a goddamn satellite dish, with everything beaming in on free preview and nothing blocked out. I can't tell where half of this stuff's coming from, and it doesn't matter. Now here's some stuff your med techs don't know. The Greys call the red growth Byrus, a word that means a stuff of life. Under some circumstances, the prime version, it can grow the implants." "The shit weasels, you mean?" "Shit weasels, that's good. I like that. They spring from the Byrus. They reproduce by laying eggs. They spread, lay more eggs, spread again. That's the way it's supposed to work anyways. Here, most of the eggs go dead. I have no idea if it's the cold weather, the atmosphere, or something else. But in environment, Underhill, it's all about the Byrus. It's all they've got that works. The stuff of life." But listen,
The Greys are having a big problem here, which is probably why they have hung around so long, half a century before making their move. The Weasels, for instance, they're supposed to be saprophytes. Do you know what that means? Henry, that's you, right, Henry? Henry, does this have any bearing on our present? It has plenty of bearing on our present situation. And unless you want to own a large part of the responsibility for the end of all life on Spaceship Earth, except for a lot of interstellar kudzu, that is, I advise you to shut up and listen. A pause. Then, I'm listening. Saprophytes are beneficial parasites. We have them living in our guts, and we deliberately swallow more in some dairy products. Sweet acidophilus milk, for instance, and yogurt. We give the bugs a place to live, and they give us something in return. In the case of dairy bacteria, improved digestion. The Weasels, under normal circumstances, normal on some other world, I guess, where the ecology differs in ways I can't even guess at, grow to a size maybe no bigger than the bowl of a teaspoon. I think that in females they may interfere with reproduction, but they don't kill. Not normally, they just live in the bowel. We give them food, they give us telepathy. That's supposed to be the trade. Only, they also turn us into televisions. We are Grayboy TV. And you know all this because you have one living inside you. There was no revulsion in Underhill's voice, but Henry felt it clearly in the man's mind, pulsing like a tentacle. One of the quote-unquote normal weasels? No. At least he thought. I don't think so. Then how do you know what you know? Or are you maybe just making it up as you go along? Trying to write yourself a pass out of here? How I know is the least important thing of all, Owen. But you know I'm not lying. You can read me. I know you think you're not lying. How much more of this mind-reading shit can I expect to get? I don't know. More if the virus spreads, probably, but not in my league. Because you're different. Skepticism, both in Underhill's voice and in Underhill's thoughts. Well, I don't know how different until today. But never mind that for a minute. For now, I just want you to understand that the Greys are in a shitpool here. Or maybe the first time in their history, they are in an actual battle for control. First, because when they get inside people, the Weasels aren't saprophytic, but violently parasitic. They don't stop eating and they don't stop growing. They are cancer, Underhill. Second, the Byrus. It grows well on the other worlds, but poorly on ours. At least so far. The scientists and the medical experts who are running this rodeo think the cold is slowing it down. But I don't think so, that's it. That's, or not all of it. I can't be positive because they don't know, but... Whoa! There was a brief cupped flame as Underhill lit another cigarette for the wind to smoke. You're not talking about the medical guys, are you? No. I think you are in touch with the Grey Boys. Telepathically in touch. I think with one of them through a link. This Jonesy you spoke of. Owen, I don't know, not for sure. The point is they are losing. Me, you, the men who went out there, to the boy with you today. We might not be around to celebrate Christmas. I won't kid you about that. We got high concentrated doses, but I've got it all right, Underhill said. But even if it really takes hold on you, I don't think you can spread it very far. It's not that catchable. There are people in the barn who will never get it, no matter how many virus-infected people they mingle with. And the people who do catch it like a cold coming down with Byrus Secondary, or Ripley, if you like that better. Let's stick to Byrus. Okay, they might be able to pass it on to few people, who would be very weak version of we could call Byrus 3. It might even be communicable beyond that, but I think once you got the Byrus 4, you would need a microscope or a blood test to pick it up, and then it's gone.